I'm Robert Wright. I'm a visiting professor of science and religion here at Union Theological Seminary. And first I want to thank everyone at Union for having me here this year, and in particular thank Serene Jones, the president of Union, who first suggested that I would feel at home here, which I do. Union is a place that really welcomes unorthodox intellectual and spiritual inquiry, and I think my presence here is testament to that, and I think I'm not the only person here whose presence is testament to that. I also want to thank the John Templeton Foundation for making it possible to have this the series of conversations that's being launched tonight with my dialogue with Steve Pinker. I think you have brochures that list the second and third in the series of conversations. There's a fourth that we did not nail down in time to be printed, but it looks like Francis Fukuyama will be here on December 8th. We'll be talking about the direction of history, whether we're headed for the singularity or the apocalypse or what. But above all, I want to thank Steve Pinker for coming here. I'm sure many of you are already suitably impressed by Steve's body of work, but just in case you're not, I would say that if you plotted all of America's public intellectuals on a graph with two coordinates, and one was sheer quantity of output, and the other was quality of output, involving, analytical acuity, cogency of argument, clarity of expression, I think you really could argue that Steve would be out there feeling lonely, separated from the from the mass of humankind. Steve looks like he doesn't agree. He's being suitably modest. Although I would say that kind of graphing exercise is the kind of thing you would do, right?
Maybe. Indeed.
And if you added a third dimension to that graph, representing versatility, I think he would be even further out there, because in addition to writing the kinds of books you'd expect a professor of psychology at Harvard to write, books on the human mind, like How the Mind Works, The Language Instinct, The Blank Slate. He's ventured into other areas, certainly including a book about human history called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which we'll be spending some time on tonight. And most recently, I think, a book on how to write well called The Sense of Style, unless you published even another book. So that's the most recent. Okay, good. The series of conversations is called Contentions, and that really means two things. First of all, we're going to contend with big ideas, cosmic questions, meaning of life questions. It also suggests that there will be a certain amount of intellectual contention in most of these conversations, that there will be some kind of divergence of viewpoint, contrasting perspectives. In a way, that's a challenge tonight because Steve and I agree on a lot. We were both writing in support of evolutionary psychology a couple of decades ago, before it had much in the way of mainstream acceptance. We've both argued that history has a kind of moral direction, and I think we both have basically naturalistic outlooks. There is a difference between us, though, that I'm hoping can provide some tension. Steve identifies as an atheist, and I am not an atheist. What I am is kind of hard to characterize. It's a kind of long, complicated story that I doubt anybody came here to hear, so we will skip that, except to say that I'm inclined to look for larger meaning in things and to say things like, well, don't you think it looks like there's some larger purpose unfolding through the workings of nature? And Steve is more inclined to say, no, I don't, I don't think so. So, to the extent that there is intellectual tension tonight, it may consist of me trying to push Steve in certain spiritual directions he doesn't want to go in. Although alternatively, he could have a conversion experience right here before our eyes, and certainly be a good place for it. So, Steve, I wanted to start out asking you about the term spiritual. A lot of people say they're spiritual but not religious. If you ask them what they mean by spiritual, I think a lot of them mean something that you would consider incompatible with a naturalistic outlook. But some people insist that there's a kind of spirituality or kinds of spirituality that are compatible with a naturalistic outlook. I'm just wondering if there's a definition of the word spiritual that you think is defensible according to which you would be spiritual.
Probably not, but it depends on how far you stretch the meaning of the word spiritual. If it encompasses the ability to experience awe, then yeah, I certainly experience awe. If it pertains to a belief in entities that are not stuff that you can't bump into, abstract entities. I do believe in abstract entities. If it embraces compassion, empathy, a feeling of connection to other sentient beings, I certainly have that. I sense, though, that when most people use the word spirituality, they have something more in mind than just those three.
Okay.
So in that sense, I would not be spiritual. I don't believe that the universe has a purpose.
Okay.
I don't believe that there are sentient, non-material forces with some kind of goal, teleology.
Okay.
Would that be? I mean, I think that's where you're heading.
That's one place.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're not spiritual.
I'm not spiritual.
But
I'm just not spiritual.
But the night is young.
Okay.
Okay, so why don't we talk a little about the better angels of our nature. It's about history. It posits a kind of moral direction in history. How would you characterize the gist of what you're claiming there?
Yeah, so in the empirical phenomena that the book addresses consist of a number of historical trends by which violence, when measured quantitatively, has gone down. We kill each other less than our ancestors do. We wage war less often. The wars are less deadly. We're less likely to subject each other to grisly torture executions, to execute each other for trivial misdemeanors. There are less acceptance of beating children, less acceptance of violence within marriages, less acceptance of violence against women. And so there are, to be honest, quite to my surprise, a large number of graphs that plot violence over time that kind of go like that. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's a phenomenon that you in Nonzero addressed not with graphs, but qualitatively, and we both agree that this is a real historical phenomenon that needs an explanation. And we overlap in at least one of those explanations. That is in Bob's book, Nonzero, referring to the concept of a non-zero-sum game in game theory, or a win-win situation. As our technology improves so that there are more non-zero sum games, more win-win situations, in particular trade, commerce, and exchanging favors, then that will tend to militate toward more cooperation and less conquest and cooperation and competition. So if it's cheaper to buy things than to steal them, then you're more likely to buy them. And if other people are more valuable to you alive than dead, because you don't kill your customers, you don't kill your creditors, then the growth of trade and commerce is naturally going to reduce the rate of violent competition. This is an idea that goes back to the Enlightenment, the idea of du commerce, from Montesquieu and Adam Smith and many of the American founders, and it's one that Bob and I both emphasize. I think it would be safe to say that would be the main explanation that you invoked in Nonzero.
That's right.
I broaden that to other pacifying forces, other ways in which a fixed human nature, which again, that's one of the zones of agreement of Bob and me, that these changes did not come about through Darwinian selection in the technical sense of substitution of genes. Many of the changes occurred too fast to be to have taken place on the scale of generations. But it must have been changes in norms and institutions that changed our behavior, which aspect of human nature got the upper hand. So I think the expansion of trade and commerce is one. I think the expansion of effective government is another. I think Hobbes got it more or less right when he argued that a leviathan, a government with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, can reduce rates of violence compared to anarchy. I think with Peter Singer, probably someone with whom you've also had dialogues, that there's been an expansion of empathy from the default setting that human nature gives us, which is basically to feel the pain of our relatives, our friends, and cute little fuzzy baby animals, that we've expanded it to embrace larger and larger polities. Singer argued that this was propelled purely by reason, by the fact that if you argue that there is something special about me, my family, my tribe, my clan, my race, you're going to lose the argument because it's a crummy argument. Rationally, you can't defend it, and I think that there's something to that. In addition, there may be more emotional forces that have pulled our circle of empathy outward. The rise of journalism, of realistic fiction, of travel that allow us to rub shoulders with other people who are not like us, to project ourselves into their lives by actual interaction or by vicarious interaction through fiction. And so it becomes harder to dehumanize or demonize other people who you know are human. And finally, I think that there's we've just gotten smarter. And just as we have chipped away at other problems that bedevil our species, like disease and hunger, by developing scientific workarounds, we figure out ways of reducing violence. A criminal justice system that is aimed at reducing rates of crime, a system of international diplomacy and intergovernmental organizations, United Nations, peacekeeping forces. And so with a bunch of technical fixes, once our ancestors decided that violence was a problem that ought to be solved, they applied their ingenuity to it, and every now and again they succeeded, and we've accumulated some of the fruits of their ingenuity.
Okay. So there's a lot there, and you mentioned Peter Singer's argument, which he puts forth in this book, The Expanding Circle, about this fact that I think is really worth dwelling on because it's kind of amazing. I mean, as I think he put it in the book, in 500 BC, members of one Greek city-state considered members of another Greek city-state subhuman. But then a few centuries later, they decided all Greeks were human. It was the Persians who weren't human, and so on, until today, in places like this, I think we would all say that everyone is deserving of respect, regardless of race, creed, or color, deserving of basic human rights. It is real progress, and it's one of the things that is involved in the reduction of violence. I think, in a way, it almost gives short shrift to your argument in your book to focus too much on the decline of violence per se, because there's been a real shift of sensibility and an expansion of the moral circle. And of course, someone who was looking for reasons to see purpose unfolding through some process would see moral improvement as, Exhibit A is one thing they would point to, if you were so inclined to do that, if you're the type of person who did that. Of course, at the same time, I mean, you're not saying things have improved along all dimensions. You're not saying there's not exploitation, injustice, and so on. But there has been that expansion of the moral circle. Now, I'm wondering how stubborn you consider the impetus behind it. You mentioned that it's not genetic evolution that's driving it. It's the same human nature that existed 2,500 years ago that exists now. It's partly technological. Technology allows us to enter into these interdependent relationships with people at great distances. And you mentioned reading and writing. That's a technology. It's a writing technology that allowed people to kind of put themselves in the minds of people in different cultures and so on, and start imagining what it's like.
Empathy technologies.
Empathy technologies, and you note that there are two senses of the word empathy, right?
At least two.
And I think that's an important distinction between feeling people's pain and just understanding what it's like to be them in a kind of more cognitive sense, right? Perspective taking.
Yes, no, and those are distinct. I mean, and they're often confused. Just to give an example that I hope will make the distinction clear. If you're taking care of a small child and a dog barks and the child is just howling in terror, your response is not necessarily to howl in terror with the child, to feel the same panic the child is feeling, but to comfort the child. So you don't literally have to feel someone's pain in order to have sympathetic concern. That is, to try to take steps to improve their welfare. So that would be the two main senses of empathy, and there are others.
Right. And I think sheer kind of cognitive empathy, perspective taking, is underrated as a virtue. I mean, it helps people successfully work out deals. Just understanding where the other person's coming from, and
cognitive empathy in the sense of knowing what someone else is thinking could also be used to manipulate them, and for the cunning, silver-tongued psychopath, and so on.
Right.
So there has to be an alignment. The sense of empathy that we care about is that you make the other person's welfare one of your goals. And one of the ways of doing that is to get into their heads and feeling the pain that they're feeling. But it's not the only one. And in fact, they can often be at cross purposes.
Right. Okay, so it's not genetic evolution that's driving this. On the other hand, the trend rests on the foundation of human nature, and there's specific parts of human nature, and you've just mentioned a couple that drive the process. What are some others?
So there's the fact that there's elasticity in our capacity for empathy. I think there's just cognitive processes, reason, rationality, the ability to think of how to solve problems once you set them up as a problem. I think there's the set of cognitive and moral intuitions that underlie what evolutionary psychologists call reciprocal altruism. That is the exchange of favors that's policed by certain moralistic emotions like gratitude. If someone does you a favor, you feel obliged to reciprocate. Guilt, if you have done someone harm and want to maintain a relationship with them, you feel the urge to compensate and apologize. Trust, you're willing to extend a favor with the expectation that it would be reciprocated when needed. Anger, if you feel you're cheated. So that suite of emotions can bind us in mutually beneficial relationships of favor exchange, which can be broadened, again, with the help of technology.
Right, and the suite of emotions, or at least subjective states or dynamics that accompany this thing called reciprocal altruism include, or thought to include by evolutionary psychologists, a sense of justice in some sense, right?
A sense of justice or fairness. And also, yeah.
Well, I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that means we are all just, but the sense that good deeds should be rewarded and bad deeds should be punished, and that is a good. That intuition seems to be built into us by evolution.
Yes, I mean, how we apply it, what we count as a good, can vary, and the foremost way that it varies is we often feel that we have been given the shortchanged, we've been given the short end of the stick. There's a tendency of two sides in any dispute both to feel aggrieved. They both agree that there's a sense of fairness. They only disagree as to who's the cheater and who's the victim. Yeah.
Right.
Also, there's a phenomenon that I don't think psychologists have studied enough, and that is the sense of norms, things that you just don't do, that extend from the trivial. If I was wearing a tuxedo tonight, I'd feel quite uncomfortable. You just don't do it. Or if I was in just bathing trunks and no shirt, no shoes, I'd feel deeply uncomfortable. Not that I can rationalize why, but there's certain sets of mutually expected conduct, and that can change in a way that can or cannot align with moral principles and violence in particular. If you're insulted, do you laugh it off, or must you retaliate violently? That can vary across cultures. Are ethnic jokes the kind of thing that you could tell and enjoy as a guilty pleasure, or offenses that would make you deeply uncomfortable to hear them, even in private? That's obviously changed over time. Racial epithets. And then on the international scale, is war, for example, just one of a number of options? As the Prussian military theorist Clausewitz said, the continuation of policy by other means? Or is it something that's just that decent nations just don't do in their dealings with other nations? So, for example, if Canada and Spain they recently had a dispute over flatfish, turbo. In dealing with this dispute, it didn't enter into either parliament that maybe we should declare war. Whereas 100 years ago, it very well could have. And again, it wasn't like either parliament weighed the pros and cons of declaring war on the other. It was just kind of unthinkable. And that change in the realm of the thinkable, what is taboo and what is on the table as a live option, is another bit of our psychology. There's some psychologists who've dealt with it. John Haidt is here, and he's written about that. But I think that's a big source of possible historical change.
Now, you, speaking of the moral sense, and you list that as one of the better angels of our nature. You list the actual better angels in the book, the parts of human nature that kind of redeem us. And I take that to include, I mean, you tell me, not things like maybe the specific sense of justice, the intuition that good deeds should be rewarded and so on, and bad deeds should be punished, but also the sense that there is such thing as the moral good. Not just an intuition about what is morally good, but the whole idea. We take this for granted, but you can certainly imagine an intelligent animal that was just nihilistic by nature and didn't talk about what was right and what was wrong, right?
Yeah.
And you once made to me an argument in conversation, and I haven't heard you make it since, but maybe you have, having to do with moral realism. It was a very speculative argument. Yeah. About a kind of moral realism, which, I mean, first, I guess you should tell them what you mean by moral realism and then maybe recap that argument.
Yeah, so moral realism is what the position that philosophers identify as the one that holds that moral, different versions, moral propositions can be objectively true or false in the same way that mathematical ones can be. That is, if you're a mathematical realist, which not all philosophers are. But that is that morality is not just a set of arbitrary social norms, it's not just a set of emotional responses, but that the statement, slavery is wrong, is in some way akin to the Pythagorean theorem. Now, this is a position that philosophers themselves, needless to say, disagree on. I'm not averse to the idea that there could be some form of moral realism, although I suspect that it would have to be stated as a contingency. That is, if you're committed to certain things which perhaps can't be objectively justified, then other things follow logically. And I think Singer's argument in The Expanding Circle, that you simply can't maintain that I deserve consideration because I'm me and you're not, that there's something that falls apart with that rationally. So to the extent that I value my own well-being, and it's kind of hard to imagine how I wouldn't if I was a rational agent and wanted to survive for the next 10 seconds so I could complete my sentence. If I am dealing with you as another rational agent, which means that the very fact that we're having this conversation means that there has to be some common ground in terms of each of us exchanging ideas with the other, then there's no basis for me saying that my interests are to be valued over yours if I want you to take me seriously. And that's how the argument might go. So, and that itself, none of that hinges on evolutionary history, other than perhaps just the will to persist, to not go out of existence. None of it hinges on brain structure, social norms, and so on. There is a kind of rationality to it, where any agents that were social, intelligent, and self-interested enough to want to not go out of existence might be under the purview of that chain of reasoning anywhere in the universe. So that's one version of moral realism. But I want to separate that, though, from our moral sense, because just as our innate mathematical sense is pretty crummy mathematics. I mean, we have a number sense that's pretty much, 1, 2, 3, many, and kind of more or less stuff in a fuzzy analog way. A mathematician would not give that a whole lot of respect, but it might be enough to bootstrap your way to the rest of mathematics. And of course, we're subject to many mathematical illusions and fallacies. The same is probably true of our moral sense, that just the intuition that there are some preferences that you universalize, that it's not just me, but everyone ought to do it. that may not align with morality as it is best defended by a moral philosopher. And in fact, you're correct to point out that I list the moral sense under the better angels column instead of the inner demons column, or chapters actually. But I also note that an awful lot of evil has been done by the moral sense. And in fact, I could have gone either way in terms of which side to put it on, because if you were to compare the amount of harm done for sheer sociopathic, amoral predation, exploitation, and profit-taking versus the amount of violence that's been done for moralistic reasons, probably more harm has been done by the moralistic violence. If you count the ideological genocides, the cruel and unusual punishments, the amount of crime that is actually not done for predatory reasons, but out of an innate sense of rough justice. Lots of people have been killed for both sets of reasons, but my guess is more for the moralistic reasons. So a lot depends on whether the moral sense, as an evolved part of our psychology, gets aligned with moral goals as we can best defend them.
Right. So there's kind of several things you need for what you might call true, robust moral progress, I guess. I mean, first, the moral sense is nice. If people believe that there's this thing called the good, and they can at least start having a discussion about what it is. The intuition that good deeds should be rewarded and bad deeds should be punished has a certain pragmatic value, kind of whether it's true or not. I mean, it's there's a reason that societies have pursued that line. I think not just because it feels right, but it kind of works.
It sets up an incentive structure.
Right.
Namely, there's certain kinds of self-interested exploitation that if they are punished, their profitability goes to zero and fewer people do it. If you get thrown in jail once you rob a liquor store, you're less likely to rob a liquor store.
Right. And the problem, of course, is that we're designed on the one hand to intuitively embrace that principle, and on the other hand to, in a certain sense, misuse it. Wouldn't you say we all naturally bias our evaluations of who did the bad thing and who did the good thing for the sake of self-interest? So the principle's nice and has potential value as a practical governing principle, but it's not enough. And the kind of so the kind of moral progress you document involves the interaction of like that, and the capacity for empathy and things like this, with a reflective intelligence, the ability to put yourself in other people's shoes, and it further requires, or at least certainly is abetted by, a kind of technological progress that changes your incentive structure, makes it actually in your interest to be able to imagine what it's like to be somebody halfway around the world, and so on. So there's a lot of things that have to come together, but when they do, there's a kind of momentum to the process, to what's going on, right? And that's why you don't think this is just some fluke you've documented. There's an underlying power.
Yeah, I think it can't be so consistent and it can't be so directional that the progress is linear or even monotonic, because there are periods in history in which it definitely goes the other way. And I document in Better Angels a number of cases in which societies have gotten more violent. I mean, three salient examples are the kind of the heyday of genocidal despots in the middle decades of the 20th century. That was definitely a reversal. The 1960s crime boom in the United States and many other Western countries, and the rise of civil wars in Africa following decolonization. So each of those have come back down, but there were periods in history where things got worse before they got better. In terms of I did at the very end of the book ask the question of the various violence reduction developments in human history, is there a common denominator? And I suggested one that is, I guess, not so far from the one in Nonzero, namely that there is often, or maybe even always, an advantage to exploitation, for one person to harm another to gain something at their expense. But of course, the harm done to the victim in general outweighs the benefit to the aggressor. That's just because we're complicated creatures. It's easier to damage someone than to benefit oneself. And since over the long run, roles reverse, victims become aggressors and vice versa, empires rise, empires fall. If you could stand back, everyone would really be better off if everyone agreed to abjure violence. The problem is, how do you get the other guy to refrain from violence at the same time that you do, given that if you are a unilateral pacifist and your neighbor isn't, then you could be inviting an invasion, or you'd be a punching bag or a sitting duck. So there's a technological challenge or an intellectual challenge of working within that game theoretic matrix. How do you get into the cell where both sides lay down their arms at the same time, not opening up the window of vulnerability where they lay them down, but making themselves ripe for exploitation for the other guy? And I think what the forces that I list have in common, and the one that you emphasized in Nonzero highlights, is there are various ways of jiggering the payoffs in the matrix so that that cell of mutual nonviolence becomes more attractive. I mean, certainly if you've got Leviathan penalizing aggression, putting you in jail if you rob the liquor store, then that changes your payoffs, and so exploitation doesn't seem so attractive anymore. Trade, obviously, changes the payoff matrix. Then there may be cognitive changes as well. If you do empathize with someone else, then their suffering now becomes one of your costs, and so you're less likely to harm them with impunity. Anyway, so I think that is what I suggested might be the common thread.
Okay. Now, when I look at the whole process, I mean, as you know, I think you can, if you look at the basic constituents that drive this, you could argue that the key ones were fairly likely to show up through evolution given enough time. For example, reciprocal altruism has evolved independently a number of times. The dynamic of kin selection, which brought us love and empathy, probably originally has, and so on. And, I think the evolution of intelligence was fairly likely. But, and I also think that then the technological evolution that carries this in certain directions has a momentum. But that's, and I don't know how you feel about those as kind of probabilistic statements. I mean, I know you do not interpret them teleologically. You don't think that's evidence that there was some, that this whole process was kind of set up, this whole machine was set up to move in that direction. But a lot of these things were kind of not unlikely products of evolution, right?
Well, I don't know if we know that. So, for example, the evolution of intelligence, it only happened with us. I mean, to a certain extent with octopuses and dolphins and so on. But the kind of cumulative language-enabled intelligence that our species has evolved couldn't be that common, or else we'd see octopuses with language and
well, of course, the way evolution works, one species is going to get there first.
But not like we and octopuses kind of competed over it.
But yeah, but in evolutionary time, us and chimps, a few million years. Anyway.
So, I mean, the way I think of it is that that niche, what I've called the cognitive niche, a term that I borrowed from John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, always existed in the sense that if there's a complex ecosystem, it's always one way to make a living is to outsmart all the other organisms. However, given that we're embodied, that doesn't come for free. Brain tissue is expensive, or whatever computational device would evolve. You have to be able to translate your brilliant insights into action, and so having hands or arms in the case of an octopus might actually make the costs of evolving intelligence pay off. And it may be a fairly narrow envelope of evolutionary precursors that ever make advanced intelligence worth evolving, in the sense of the benefits outweighing the costs. The costs being things like brain tissue, vulnerability to brain damage, slowness in responding, and so on. So I think intergalactically, probably intelligence evolved numerous times. But I don't know, I think we don't know how easy it is to get into that part of the space in which increases in intelligence pay off.
Yeah. Well, I think a key phrase is given enough time. So I know you don't see that kind of purpose or meaning in the process, but you did write in The Better Angels, what could be more fundamental to our sense of meaning and purpose than a conception of whether the strivings of the human race over long stretches of time have left us better or worse off. So in what sense do you mean that? What kind of purpose and what kind of meaning?
Oh, that is human purpose and meaning, not kind of cosmic purpose and meaning. Namely, we suffer, we prosper, we're bound into social networks where we care about other people's prospering and suffering. And given that we have the goal of making ourselves and other people better off, what will accomplish that goal? So in particular, are the institutions and norms and technologies and values that have accompanied modernity taken us in the right direction? Or should we just tear everything down and start over again? And this is really goes back to the kind of romantic versus Enlightenment conceptions of history. Namely, was there some blessed state from which we have fallen? Did civilization make us worse off? That's kind of the Rousseauan view, and therefore, if we want to improve our lot, we should tear stuff down and get back to nature. Or did we start off in some rather unpleasant set of circumstances, and our institutions like government and commerce and science have been workarounds and that have made us better off? Mm-hmm. So that's what I had in mind. Okay.
So one thing that some people mean by spirituality, or at least an idea that you see in a lot of spiritual traditions, is that we are fundamentally deluded, and spiritual practice and spiritual discipline consists of becoming less so and seeing the world more clearly. This is probably most explicit in Buddhism, where the goal is enlightenment, and the idea is that we are deluded. And so I'm interested in the question of how deluded we are by nature, how clearly we do and don't see the world. Now, I mean, first of all, I guess you'd agree that, strictly speaking, natural selection doesn't care about the truth or clarity of vision in the first instance. In other words, if delusion will help you get your genes spread, then delusion there will be built into human nature. Now that's a principle, but that doesn't by itself tell us, how often delusion has been built in and in what circumstances. So what's your view on that?
Yeah, so I mean that's that very much aligns with the project of the Enlightenment, namely in a natural state we're not particularly enlightened. We're subject to illusions and fallacies and biases, and that's kind of one of the central messages of cognitive psychology of the last 50 years or so. But that our institutions like science and education and philosophy and arenas of free speech allow us to purge our illusions and fallacies and biases, to acquire knowledge, to deliberate more rationally, and that is a good thing. So I hadn't thought to really, I don't think of that as Buddhist, but I know very little about Buddhism, but if it is, maybe I'm a Buddhist, and I never realized it. Maybe I've been speaking prose all my life, and maybe I've been a Buddhist without realizing it. Mm-hmm. But certainly that idea that we started out fairly ignorant, that evolution clearly gave, in giving us this outsized brain, clearly we have some tools that allow us to figure out how things work. Mm-hmm. Left to their own devices, they leave us with all kinds of superstitions and nonsense and primitive forms of thinking. But with literacy, with accumulation of cultural wisdom, we're gradually overcoming them.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's figure out whether you are a Buddhist. Let me press this a little further. I mean, it seems to me that that the most important delusions are kind of in the moral realm, you might say. Mm-hmm. And the most fundamental is that we are designed by natural selection to consider ourselves special, very special, and maybe our offspring very special, and our siblings pretty special, and so on, and our friends intermittently special, and so on. But we can't all be right? I mean, it can't be the case that all of us are more important than everyone else, and yet we all kind of act as if that's the case, on a day-to-day basis in little ways. Like if you're just holding up your hand to get a cab and you see somebody holding up their hand, then you hold yours up a little higher, like as if in some sense it's more important for you to get it than, and for all you know, the other person's a doctor rushing to the hospital to save a life or something. It seems to me that that bias infiltrates our perception and cognition in really subtle ways. Does that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think I mentioned that one of the central messages of cognitive psychology is that we're subject to fallacies and error. One of the main messages of social psychology is that we're subject to self-serving biases, that we do tend to overweight our own interests, overweight our own rectitude, our own competence. And so enlightenment would consist of, and in fact this actually goes back to the Enlightenment. It's social psychology starting from the 1950s demonstrated these self-serving biases in the lab, but it was very much a topic of debate among the great Enlightenment philosophers of Adam Smith and Hume and many others.
And, I think this, it gets in the way of something you championed, which is cognitive empathy. It can be good to put yourself in the shoes of others, but wouldn't you say we are designed by natural selection to negotiate a landscape of allies on the one hand and enemies and rivals on the other? And we assess each of them in very different ways, and our ability to actually understand what's motivating them and put ourselves in their shoes differs depending on whether we put them in the friend or enemy category, and that fosters tribalism and so on, right?
Yes, in fact, it's painful even to temporarily put yourself in the shoes of an enemy, even if only to figure out what makes them tick. So, if I were to say to you, well, try to see it from Hitler's point of view. You bristle even with that thought, even though there's a sense in which if we wanted to prevent genocides in the future, we really ought to see it from Hitler's point of view, if only not to sympathize with his goals, but to figure out what gave rise to him and how to prevent that from happening in the future. But as Vito Corleone once said, "Never hate your enemies; it clouds your judgment."
Right. Right. And I mean, they're really subtle dynamics. Like apparently, in assessing whether someone does something because of the kind of person they are or because of circumstantial factors, the tendency is, with friends and allies, when they do something good, you say, yeah, that's them. That's essence of them expressing itself. When they do something bad, you say, no, it's just they didn't get their nap or something. With enemies, it's the opposite. And that really, you can go back and look at like wars we've gotten into and so on, and see how once you put Saddam Hussein in the enemy camp, and you're thinking of him that way, then he can't get out of the box, because anything seemingly good he does is a trick, and anything bad he does is the real Saddam Hussein. People just don't, it's hard, isn't it even hard for you in your everyday life to remind yourself of biases, to transcend them?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a lifelong struggle. There's one of my favorite analyses of the motives behind violence came from a brilliant but underappreciated book by the social psychologist Roy Baumeister called Evil, where he notes and has done some laboratory studies to show that there's a coherent victim narrative and there's a coherent perpetrator narrative in any act of harm. And both of them differ from a narrative of a neutral observer. That the perpetrator narrative is always, it was the circumstances, I did what anyone would do in that position, the harm was minor, and it's time to get over it, let's move on, let bygones be bygones. The victim narrative is, I was minding my own business, and then a psychopath harmed me for the sheer pleasure of watching me suffer. the harm is permanent and we must never forget it. History, never forget. And he showed this by a simple means of simply having people recite a story from memory, taking the viewpoint of the perpetrator or the victim, and just counting up the distortions relative to a neutral set of instructions for people who didn't empathize with either party. And you can see that played out in history, where both the cultivation of memory, as opposed to the desire to move on, the attribution of the act to circumstances as opposed to inborn character, the motive of sheer malevolence as opposed to some more instrumental motive. All of them differ between the perpetrator and the narrative and the victim. But even more interestingly, he noted that the viewpoint of the scientist or the analyst in general is very similar to the viewpoint of the perpetrator. Namely, you take a causal stance. What in the prior circumstances led to that? You try to understand how A caused B. The moralist has the same stance as the victim. Namely, this is incomprehensible. This is, it's almost an insult to try to comprehend it, because then you'd be subscribing to the fallacy that to understand all is to forgive all. To ask why, what led the perpetrator to do it is a way of excusing the perpetrator. And so scientists, and this is a kind of an occupational hazard of being a social psychologist or a moral psychologist, is that it will always look as if you're excusing the victim, the perpetrator, I mean.
And that intuition is, to me, an interesting one itself. The common intuition that to explain is to excuse. I think that could use more exploration, because I suspect that is pretty deep-seated in us for particular reasons. But it's a great impediment to honest discourse about what's going on in the world. You can't, you can barely ask yourself why somebody joined ISIS without being accused of being an ISIS lover.
Likewise, if you try to, many scholars, historians who've tried to explain the Holocaust have been criticized by the moral philosophers who want to sacralize the Holocaust by saying that even the attempt to understand it is a disrespect to the victims, and that this ought to be kept a cosmic mystery, that there is evil in the universe, and to try to explain it in terms of antecedent conditions is somehow lessening the enormity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now back to my campaign to turn you into a Buddhist, or to see if you are one. So I think you're agreeing that we categorize people and judge people in subtle ways without even realizing it, and that influences our evaluation of them. I think in Buddhism, implicit in Buddhist philosophy is the idea that one thing, the way that works is our affect, our feelings, and our cognition are much more closely intertwined than you might think. It used to be in psychology, there's cognition, there's affect. That was kind of the way it was presented. In Buddhism, the idea is that really our perception of everything almost is suffused with affect, with feelings, and that is a way of judging it. Inanimate things, and of course the function of feelings to an evolutionary biologist is in a sense to judge things that are good for the organism feels good about, and so on. So I think a certain amount of the discipline in some meditation traditions is to liberate yourself from the judgments that are so finely ingrained in your perceptions of things, certainly including people. So I take it you would consider that a laudable goal?
Yes, I guess the reason that I'm unlikely to call myself a Buddhist is not just because it would, a nice Jewish boy from Montreal, it would be, I think
well,
upset
as
my
you
mother.
know, there are
Bujus.
There
Yes,
are
I do.
Bujus, yes.
There are.
No few.
But I guess I'm resistant to identifying these ideas with a particular religion or ideology, just that if they can be defended as valuable things to do, then that's all the justification you need. And to say, well, it belongs to this tribe, this religion, this ideology is kind of gratuitous. Either it's defensible or it isn't. And if it's defensible, there are reasons, and the reasons should be sufficient in themselves.
Yeah, so the problem is calling it Buddhist, not the idea itself.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, that is, I mean, I think whether it's Buddhist or
So
not.
if I call it Buddhist philosophy rather than Buddhist religion, it's okay. It's like calling something Kantian.
Yeah.
And could be true or not true.
Yeah, but I mean, I tend to resist signing up to schools of philosophy for the
Right.
same reason.
Right.
Just because they're probably right about some things and not about others, and you really have to, pick and choose what's defensible and not buy the whole system.
Okay. I'm going to persist along this line for one more minute. It's just that, I think you agree that we're all under the impression that we are more special than the average person. We can't all be right. The best guess is that everyone's equally important, right? I mean, that would be your moral philosophy, I assume. So when someone has in Buddhist it's called in Buddhism it's called the not-self experience. There are comparable experiences in other contemplative traditions, kind of a breakdown of the walls of the self, a sense that you are your identity is almost continuous with other people's. Maybe it's not that dramatic, but in any sense, an implication is that they are as important as you, and you for that moment at least care as much about their suffering as your own. That would be a movement toward moral truth.
Yes,
you nodded.
Yeah.
We're done. I got you to nod.
Except to the extent that there also are responsibilities to the self, simply because there are more things that you can do that affect your own welfare than that can affect anyone else's welfare, with the possible exception of dependent children. You're trying to convert me to a Buddhist. I'll try to convert you to a Jew for a minute. Rabbi Hillel.
Union is a very ecumenical place.
Yeah, that's right. Rabbi Hillel wisely said, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I?" There is some moral value to self-responsibility, self-help, self-regard, insofar as you do have more power to influence your own well-being than anyone else's, and there is a certain responsibility in exercising that as well. So total selflessness might go a little too far.
Might be. It might. I would not call that a rampant problem in the world today.
No, agreed.
Unbridled selflessness.
Agreed. I mean, there are a number of you probably are familiar with the new book by Larissa McFarquhar called Drowning Strangers. My wife, Rebecca Goldstein, reviewed it for the New York Review. It was reviewing for the New York Review of Books, and other reviews have come out about people who really take this to an extreme and adopt 23 children, or give up everything to set up a leper colony and actually inject themselves with a leprosy bacillus to help advance treatment, who give away everything to the most effective possible charity. And it is an interesting psychological and philosophical challenge as to whether all of us ought to be extreme altruists, and whether, I should not be wearing this jacket because I could wear a much cheaper one, and with the difference I could probably buy a mosquito bed net for someone in Africa. By those standards of complete selflessness, that is, you may not, and again, Peter Singer, I don't think he's a Buddhist, but he actually made the argument that if we were ethically consistent, we would not possess anything that beyond the point where it could make someone better off if we were to donate that away. We should live the minimally adequate material life to survive, to be better off, or actually as well off as the people we could benefit.
Right.
Now, few of us can muster that degree of altruism. It's an interesting implication whether that means that we are all extremely immoral to a vaster extent than any of us would admit. And I'm not sure whether or not Buddhism and extreme altruism, in the sense of donating everything beyond the bare minimum, coincide.
I don't think many people get there in any spiritual tradition. And I should say that, most lay Buddhists in Asia are not meditating to begin with.
But are they giving a lot of money to deworm the world and to other charities that give well rates to be the most efficient way to benefit other people, for example?
I haven't done that research.
Yeah,
I would have
I
assumed
doubt
you
it.
would have, given all the other research you've done, but no. Well, I guess the last thing I'd say about that is I think these biases are sufficiently hard to root out. I mean, the self-centered judgments of other people and everything, that it's the reason some people do intensive spiritual disciplines. Not just meditation, but various kinds of monastic practice, prayer, whatever. And it works for some people.
But they would not raise the question, instead of meditating, if I went out and earned some money and gave it away to Oxfam, would I be doing more good than just reflecting on myself and trying to change my inner life?
Well, they might meditate and then do that, conceivably. But I know Peter Singer wrestles with that in his latest book on effective altruism. Okay, so before we go to Q&A, I just want to invite you to say anything you haven't said about. I mean, the title of this is "Science in the Search for Meaning," by which I meant to encompass science and social science and meaning in various senses, and I've kind of tried to channel you down a couple of specific paths, but I want to give you the chance to talk about how science and social science inform your own life and your view of meaning.
Yeah. Well, I think it thoroughly infiltrates my understanding of meaning and value and purpose in a large number of ways. One of them is simply a kind of a debunking or a purifying way. There are a lot of sources of meaning and value and purpose that I can't subscribe to because they are part of a view of the universe that I believe is false, that science has shown to be false. The idea that there are that everything happens for a reason that concerns me, that if misfortune befalls me, there must be some sentient agent that wants that to happen. The idea that there are no coincidences, so everything happens for the best. The idea that meaning and purpose come from ritual or scripture. All of those I reject because I believe that they're factually incorrect. And as a result, I don't strive to follow all 613 commandments in the Torah. I don't accept Jesus as my savior. There's a long list of things I don't do because I don't think that the basis for them stands up to scrutiny. But at the same time, I think that the impersonal nature of the cosmos, combined with the fact that I am a goal-seeking entity, I don't want to die. I want to flourish and prosper. I know that I am no different from other people, and that I am enmeshed with other people as a member of a social species and as a member of a rational species. It means that I cannot favor my own interests over others and defend that I ought to value other people's interests as well as my own. The fact that the larger circumstances that lead us all to flourish or suffer are my responsibility and all of our collective responsibility. We can't outsource it to some cosmic force, that it's only our own efforts that are going to deal with the problems facing us. So those would be a number of ways in which having a causal view of the universe as consisting of impersonal forces that don't care about us, but one of whose products is a sentient, rational being that can set up as its own purpose the maximization of flourishing and the minimization of suffering is what gives purpose to my own life.
Okay. So we are going to go to Q&A. I want to first say that, again, there's going to be several more of these conversations in 2 weeks. I guess it's November 10th. We're going to talk about consciousness and the weirdness of consciousness and the difficulty of kind of coming up with a satisfactory explanation consciousness, which I think we talked about, and I think you respect the difficulty of the problem. And in any event, your wife does, and she will be here. Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, the novelist and philosopher. Her novel is called The Mind-Body Problem, and she also did her dissertation on that. And also David Chalmers will be here. There's an event next week that is not part of the Contention series, but will be interesting. The title is Evolution and Original Sin. It's about evolutionary psychology, the evolutionary psychology view of human nature, and looking at the Christian doctrine of original sin in that light. And for that matter, arguing about whether evolutionary psychology is a valid view, because one of the panelists will be Paul Bloom, who was a student of yours, I think. And another one will be Pamela Cooper-White, who is here, a professor of psychology and religion, and then the theologian Serene Jones, the aforementioned Serene Jones, will be on that panel, and that is November 4th. So, do people have questions? You were first up, sir, in the second row. If you can wait for a microphone, and if you're extroverted enough to identify yourself, I encourage that, but it's not a requirement.
I guess this is microphone. My name is Daniel. I got a question. You both mentioned equality, equal worth. I happen to be a Christian, and so I believe in these concepts very dearly. What I can't figure out is how a materialist can believe in equality. Because when we open our eyes and look at this material world, what we see are tremendous distinctions between people. What then is the basis for equality?
I'm not sure I know what materialist means, because I'm certainly a naturalist. I believe that only in things that can be shown by reason and science. And I believe in things that aren't material, like numbers and information and bits and algorithms and theorems and so on. So I certainly believe in abstract entities, although I don't believe in a deity, simply because I don't think there's any good evidence that a deity exists. And why should we respect equality? Because the differences that are so salient to us and that you point out are irrelevant to how we ought to treat each other. Namely, we all have the capacity to suffer and to flourish. And that gives us the basis for respecting the rights of other sentient entities. The fact that our skin color is different or our genitalia are different or is irrelevant to our capacity to suffer and flourish.
If I may just follow up once, we all have very different capacities to suffer. And in fact, it would be very hard to prove that we all have the same capacities to suffer. Would that make me more valuable because I have this greater capacity, or I have a greater creativity or a greater intelligence?
If a smarter person doesn't suffer any more or less, so the intelligence is irrelevant to that. Likewise, creativity.
Can you prove that, though?
What?
Can you prove that certain people, we all suffer the same amount?
Okay, I think we should...
Pretty close, yeah, because we all have pretty similar nervous systems. And this is something, although you don't have to look at the nervous system directly to make that observation. Even Shylock said, "Hath not a Jew eyes?" That entire speech that humanized Shylock consisted of a set of observations of our common capacity to suffer and to flourish. So that was just Shakespeare's folk psychology.
And is understanding evolution actually of value here in the sense that once you understand that your instinctive valuing of yourself over others and your kin and so on is a legacy of a process that values genetic proliferation above all and is presumably in that sense morally arbitrary? I mean, does that actually assist you in becoming more egalitarian in your concerns?
Yes, absolutely. That is, knowing where the intuitions come from that would value myself or my tribe, I can set it as a problem to be solved, to try to downplay it, to try to minimize it, knowing that it's an irrational legacy a process that doesn't have any moral worth. By the way, the other part of the argument for equality is that once you're engaged in any kind of conversation, rational discourse with someone, once you're trying to persuade them of anything, you are automatically treating them as an equal by dint of providing them with reasons that they will accept according to their own lights, which are the same as your lights. So those are the two bases for equality.
Where's the microphone at the moment? I'm going to attain a certain efficiency of. So why don't we pass it to him?
Oh yeah, I'm Charles Kennedy, by the way. I loved your idea about decreasing violence and stuff, which I think is true for the most part, but I have noticed that today the weapons manufacturing industry, the arms industry, which is global in its scope and exerts tremendous power and pressure on politicians everywhere across the globe. How is that an exception to this trend of decreasing violence? Because there are companies that literally just are constantly beating the drums of war. And is that some sort of exception? Is that a countervailing force to this trend of decreasing violence because they're more organized, they have better ways of seducing politicians and riling up demagoguery and stuff? And is there a way that we can wrestle with the weapons industry and the saber rattlers in a way to defeat them ultimately? And are there examples of that happening throughout history? Some people would say the European Union did a very good job of that. I don't know how they accomplished that. How do we deal with the weapons industry?
Yeah. I don't think there is it's an old idea. It isn't a recent idea that the merchants of death, the masters of war, the munitions manufacturers actually cause wars. They certainly can contribute. That is, it's with all of especially the light arms and small arms that circulate so easily. It's very easy to start up a terrorist or a guerrilla group or an insurgency. But since there are more and more weapons, but there's been fewer and fewer wars, it can't just be that as many weapons as there are that cause people, that there are that many wars. So it's really a question of how they're used. And so the relationship is complicated. They certainly don't help, but the existence of weapons itself does not cause war as a consequence. People can disarm, and conversely, when you feel the need to defend yourself or attack someone else, often the weapons materialize, as in the massive ramp-up of the munitions industry in the United States during World War II. World War II was probably won because Detroit very quickly converted from making cars to making tanks and planes. And it wasn't that those tanks were sitting around before the war, but they were a response to the war. You should probably sample from all sides.
Right there.
Based on what you said, it sounds like you believe that there is such a thing as good, or better, the better angels of our nature, and you talked a bit about it being contingent. Do you also believe there's such a thing as evil, and what's its intellectual derivation?
Yeah, certainly one could argue that psychopaths are evil in the sense that they're indifferent to the welfare of others and are instrumentally exploitative. I think and certainly I would use the word evil in making moral judgments myself. So there's no question that Hitler is evil, that ISIS is evil. Although as a scientist, I also want to understand why people do what they do, and that does require, at least temporarily, setting aside the good-evil valuation long enough to understand what makes them tick. And I would say that doing that, which is not a way of excusing harmful behavior, itself is good in the sense that if we could figure out how to reduce it in the future, we have added to the good of the world. And so the sort of temporary amoral cause and effect stance, I think itself is good from a wider perspective.
Okay, can I press you a little on evil? Because first of all, what you mean exactly, a lot of people just mean really, really, really bad. Yeah. Historically, it had a kind of a deeper meaning than that. The idea of evil was that it's kind of like a grand unified theory of bad. In other words, everyone who does bad things is inhabited by a force that's evil. And I think that connotation lingers. And it points to what I think is kind of a downside to using the term, because once you call, it gets back to like clearly explaining behavior. Once you call someone evil or ISIS evil, to a lot of people that means beyond explanation, beyond the material realm. So, do you have...
I think, no, I agree. I think that's an insightful observation, and that, in fact, Baumeister, in his book called Evil, argues that that's the term that the victim use, and hence the moralist uses to describe the perpetrator. And part of the attribution of evil is an unwillingness to look for causes. And so there can be something pernicious about reaching to evil too quickly as an explanation, because it means that you are resisting the attempt to understand it.
Do you still have a question? Yeah. Okay. If you wait 1 second for a microphone.
So when you were discussing the factors that led to this decrease in violence, I noticed that you didn't actually explicitly state that capitalism was one of the factors, and I'm just wondering...
That reduce violence or that
Yes.
increase violence? That
No,
reduce
that
violence.
reduced violence,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Mhm.
I said
Yeah.
increase. And so I'm just wondering how you see capitalism being an institution sort of predicated on people maximizing their own self-interest, pursuing their own self-interest as being a factor in
Yeah.
this reduction in violence.
So I would fold that into the growth of commerce as one of, and this is also one of the major themes of Bob's book, Nonzero, that when it becomes easier to exchange for mutual benefit, that decreases the incentives toward violence. Now, I realize that that goes against a huge strain of academic, intellectual, moralist, and religious thought in which commerce is inherently evil, and nothing gets a stronger reaction, I have found, than saying that capitalism has been a source that reduces violence. In contemporary intellectual life, that's almost a heresy, even though it has honorable antecedents in the Enlightenment and in the notion of gentle commerce. And empirically, there is something to it. Obviously, like any human activity, there can be exploitation, and capitalism isn't the same as anarcho-capitalism, that is completely unregulated, unrestrained capitalism, just as freedom isn't the same as anarchy in general. But there are studies that try to look at the degree of openness to global markets and likelihood of getting into a war. And in general, the countries that are, on average, more open market have a lower likelihood of fighting a war. And so many of you might be familiar with the theory of the democratic peace, that democracies don't fight each other. Well, democracy and capitalism are correlated, not perfectly, because there are authoritarian capitalist countries and democratic, highly socialist, highly regulated countries. But if you try to tease them apart in a regression, there are arguments it's actually the capitalism that drives the peace more than the democracy. And that immediately sounds absurd until you think of examples like China, which is an authoritarian, not a capitalist country, not at all democratic, highly capitalist, and hasn't fought a war in at least 27 years, and that was a pretty small war. Much better record than the United States, for example.
Okay, I think let's take two more questions and start with John here. And who else has a question? Maybe we can just ask them consecutively. Okay, all the way back there then.
I think this gentleman had his hand up right from the beginning.
Okay, then why don't we do three and just ask them all as pithily as possible, and then I'll let you respond to all of them collectively, okay?
So how do we take account of the limits of what we take to be rationality? And how do we assess accurately our capacities for rationality, given that not just evolutionary bias or inherent organic self-interest, but the ways in which our conceptions of what counts as rational are funded by a variety of narrative, ways of imagining the world, mythological conceptions, and of course, yes, self-interest. So, who could argue against being reflective and intelligent? This is a kind of a self-defeating process, but it seems to me that what we need to account for are the ways in which our capacity to rise to capacities for self-reflectivity can be deeply limited and conditioned by factors that we are mostly unaware of most of the time.
Right.
Psychological, evolutionary, et cetera. And so what we mean by spirituality, I think, are precisely the deep disciplines that make it possible for us to do the work of arriving at the capacity for intelligence. And of course, intelligence at the moment is technological, is bringing us to the point of near self-extinction.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's right. But the thing about rationality is that it can always, it's recursive. That is, it can take itself as an object. And when we identify flaws or shortcomings in a particular system of rationality, we can then step outside that system, reflect back on it, identify what the problems are, and develop workarounds for it. So that the thing about reason is that it is inherently self-improving. That is, it can always reflect back on itself and identify problems in our understanding of reason at any given time. I don't think spirituality helps at all to the extent that spirituality, or some aspect of spirituality, cannot itself be defended by reason.
Right, but if one thing spirituality does is clarify your thinking, so to speak, and strip away the biases we've talked about, that would be a kind of a defense of the spiritual discipline, right?
When it does that, if it's not itself justified by reason, I think most people would probably not use the word spiritual in that case. Now, to the extent that something that you'd want to call spiritual can be defended by reason, it seems to me that the spiritual label is kind of gratuitous.
Well, it's kind of a pragmatic defense.
Yeah, I mean, if we can defend a particular spiritual, mindset, practice, attitude, emotion by reason, then yes, we ought to use it because we can defend it by reason. And if not, then not.
But isn't it a reasonable defense of it to say it allows them to see more clearly, just the way glasses allow you to see more clearly? That's a defense of glasses. If this allows you to see more clearly and behave more decently toward other people, that's a kind of defense of the discipline. A reasonable, a rational defense of the discipline in a pragmatic sense.
Yes, to the extent that I mean, I think that the entire referent to the term spirituality would include a lot of stuff that makes us more ethnocentric, more
oh, sure, lots of things have been done under the label, yeah.
Yeah, so that's why I'm not sure that spirituality adds anything to defensible practices.
Okay, so then there, and then the final question will be here.
Hi, Dr. Pinker. My name is Brian Cateman. I'm president of the Reducitarian Foundation.
Which foundation?
The Reducitarian Foundation.
Reducitarian?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether our increased understanding of the sentience of animals and their ability to feel pain has led and is going to lead for moral progress for them, and how we can square that with the fact that 60 billion factory farmed animals are suffering every year.
Yes, no, I think that I think it's not a coincidence that the author of The Expanding Circle, Peter Singer, is also the author of Animal Liberation. Namely, that if you follow this logic, then one ought to attach moral worth to the suffering and flourishing of animals as sentient beings. And that for those of you who haven't heard the term, reducitarian is the movement that doesn't strive to reduce meat consumption to zero, a goal that many people find impossible to attain, but simply to consume less meat. I mean, if you go from 5 hamburgers a week to 1 hamburger a week, that saves as many cows as if you go from 1 hamburger a week to 0 hamburgers a week. And so there's a sense in which reducitarian may actually be the more morally defensible movement than the extreme abnegation of all sorts of meat that vegetarianism calls for. So yeah, there is, I think there is an irrefutable case for minimizing the suffering of animals. It's sort of hard to argue against that. Yeah.
Hi. You mentioned altruism, and I've read recently that you've written skeptically about group selection.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a sort of a resurgence among evolutionary psychologists now, such that altruistic groups outperform selfish groups. I was wondering if any of your thinking has evolved since this resurgence of the group selectionist perspective.
Yeah, I don't think that that group selection is a particularly useful concept, and I have an article called "The False Allure of Group Selection." It actually originated in an exchange between me and John Haidt, and John is more sympathetic to the concept than I am. So yeah, I don't think it's necessary to explain altruism as we actually find it in humans, and I think that one of the factual premises is highly dubious, namely that groups that dominate other groups or obliterate them are altruistic. They may just be more ruthless. You tend not to see the groups that have had spectacular military success at conquest. Those aren't the groups that tend to be nice to their kids, nice to little old ladies. They tend to be the ones that have slaves and caste systems and ruthless military training and indoctrination. So I think it's that factual premise that group against group competition is fostered by within group altruism that I think is most dubious.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I personally could continue this for some time, but I'm sure some of you want to get home for the World Series, if for no other reason. There are more important things than the meaning of life, after all. So I just want to say that, even if Steve didn't deserve our gratitude for the aforementioned body of work, he deserves it for enduring Amtrak at its worst and enduring my apparently fruitless endeavor to induce a conversion experience here tonight. So thank you, Steve.